Hi everybody, welcome back. Good to see you guys this morning. So just a couple minutes to get comfortable and get yourself prepared, and we'll get started at 10. This is our Friday, May 1st meeting for Intro to Philosophy there at Chapman, 10 a.m. to 10:50 section. So good to see everybody, whether you're watching this live at a later time, 100 years in the future. Welcome. Okay. All right, everybody. Hope you're doing well, and of course, let me know if you're here watching. Just say hi. Feel free to drop a comment. Any questions, thoughts, whatever you have for me. It's always nice to interact and to get in a little bit of back and forth during our meetings. So don't be shy. Hi, Jessica. Good to see you. Good morning. Okay, just about another minute or so. We'll be ready to go. Hi, Bridger. How's my quarantine going? I don't know. I think it's been going pretty well for me. I miss social events and all of those things, like probably everybody. But, I have a lot of things keeping me busy during this time. I have a lot of classes that I'm teaching, so it hasn't been that disruptive of my everyday schedule. I know a lot of people work in fields where they've been forced to be furloughed or laid off, so I feel just kind of grateful that I work as a professor. My whole life growing up, they always said, well, not my whole life because I made my decisions like a little later, but pretty much from the moment I decided I wanted to do philosophy, people were like, what are you ever going to do with your life? How are you ever going to stay employed? But it's ironic, isn't it, that this is one of the most secure positions that actually right now. No, I feel good about what's going on with me. I'm just worried about anybody else out there that might be getting sick. But no, I'm healthy, staying physically active, running a lot, in a socially responsible, distant way. I don't know, cooking more, ordering food, takeout and stuff. Yeah, I don't know, it's good. But my heart goes out to all those that are more vulnerable, that are struggling, and hopefully, I haven't heard any single student that said they got sick or whatever, so I guess good luck for now. Hey, William, good to see you too. Okay, guys, well, it's pretty much 10. Welcome back, one and all. Thank you guys for being up this morning and checking out the lecture. So today's meeting is all about finishing, or at least mostly finishing, the philosophy of mind topic that we've been working on. So we just have one more author on this, and the man's name is Alan Turing. So today's lecture is all about his work, his essay. Alan Turing. So he lived from 1912 until 1954. And in 1950, he wrote a paper that is kind of a classic paper, and it's called Computing Machinery and Intelligence. Computing Machinery and Intelligence by Alan Turing from the year 1950. Now, just a little bit of context to kind of bring us back up to speed. We're working with the subject of the philosophy of mind. And that whole topic is about the idea of consciousness. What's its ultimate nature and basis? The fact that we can think, perceive, feel, the fact that we have inner mental lives. What is that? Is that something that's just physical? Is that just the brain? Or is there something that is non-physical about it? Is there something like a soul, of immaterial mind that is conscious or not? Now, some people are monists. They say that everything's made out of one substance, and pretty much the substance that we're talking about with monism is the material substance. So some monists call themselves physicalists. Those are the individuals who believe everything is made out of matter. Consciousness is too. Matter is just things that are extended in space, essentially atoms at the base level. On the other hand, there are dualists who say that there's both matter and mind, so there's two substances in the universe. Matter is just atoms that extend in space and compose physical objects, but the mind is some kind of non-material, not extended, not made out of matter, but yet conscious. Descartes argued for dualism. He said that the mind and the body are separate because you can clearly imagine the two things existing separately. And God would not want you to have a clear and distinct conceivability if it wasn't true, because he's not a deceiver. Then we looked at Daniel Stoljar. Daniel Stoljar said, physicalism could be understood through the concept of supervenience, which says that everything basically is built out of atoms. And if there was another universe with the same atomic structure, it would have to have the same global features, all the way including consciousness and perception. And then last meeting was J.J.C. Smart. J.J.C. Smart basically said sensations are the same thing as brain processes. Therefore, they're physical things. They're nothing different from the brain and the brain states. That's all that they are. So they're physical. And if they weren't, then they would be this mysterious nomological dangler, meaning something that you can't explain scientifically. And that's what scientists don't want. They don't want there to be some things in reality that science can't touch. And why should that be? I mean, how come if it's one world that there's a whole bunch of physical stuff operating according to physical laws, but what? Consciousness is somehow divorced from the physical reality and the laws of nature that govern everything else. So anyway, yeah, he says sensations are brain processes, and then he tries to take on the best criticisms from dualists and tries to discredit their objections. So we talked about several of the objections that he mentioned. The main one was the objection that sensations cannot be brain processes because I can clearly imagine, I can clearly talk about my experiences, but I can't say anything at all about what's going on in my brain. How could the two things be the same if it's easy to talk about a sensation but have no idea about the brain process that is supposed to be equal to it? But in terms of replying to that, Smart said that you can have two different words or descriptions that refer to one thing, even if you're not aware of it. Think of the morning and the evening star, which were believed for a while to be two objects, but actually there's just one thing. There's one object that the two words refer to. Or lightning and electricity. Those are not two different things. That's one thing, which could be referred to under a physical description or an informal description, but there's not two objects, the lightning and the electricity, they're just one thing. So he says that's the same with sensations and brain processes. The words that refer to that thing seem like they're two different things, but that's just a linguistic distinction, not a physical difference of two objects. And then another one was the words don't have the same meaning, so how could they be the same thing? Again, he repeats, words can mean different things but still refer to the same object. Another objection was sensations don't seem to have a physical location in space, but the brain process does. Again, he just replies by saying, well, no, the sensation is a brain process, so it is literally located in the brain, but we just don't usually say that because it doesn't suit the purposes of everyday conversation to mention, and it's kind of a given. And then the final thing that I just talked to you guys about at the end was the Cartesian objection, that you can imagine yourself having sensations even if you didn't have a brain at all. Like, for example, in the method of doubt, that's considered to be possible. But in reply to that, Smart says, that sounds like a ghost theory of consciousness, but there's alternatives to the ghost theory. For example, the brain theory of consciousness. And since that has more plausibility and it's more consistent with empirical and scientific evidence, he thinks that's the more reasonable viewpoint on that. So, okay, just my quick summary, if I could, of the last few meetings. Now let's go ahead and talk about Turing. Okay, I want to tell you, first of all, some background about Turing himself, a little biography. Has anyone ever heard this person's name or know a little bit about his own personal biography? I figure it's possible that you have, because actually there have been some films made about him, and some of these films are relatively recent. Anybody? Turing? Faintly recognizable, or you have nothing for me? Just wondering if the name or the concept. So you did watch the movie. Okay, good. Yes, there's a great movie about him. That's right. The movie's called The Imitation Game. Actually, I believe Benedict Cumberbatch won the Oscar for his portrayal of Turing. So that movie, though, focused on other elements of his life. They talked more about his work in another field. So let me now start to give you some of the details. Alan Turing is known as the forefather of the digital computer. So he's like the architect, basically you could say the creator of the digital computer. And how important is that, right? I mean, computers, right? We're using them every day, all the time. Right now, even, it would be hard for us to even get through a day in modern life without access to the internet or with computing systems. So they've greatly revolutionized modern living, as anybody living today would understand. Therefore, we, I think, all owe a huge debt of gratitude collectively to the contributions that Alan Turing did make. But the movie Imitation Game focused more on a different aspect of his life, which is actually related to his computer programming work. That is, he was a code breaker for the Allies during World War II. So you could see that his life spans over the World War II period. And he was a British citizen, so Britain, America, and Allied powers fighting against the Axis powers, Nazi Germany, and them. He was able to intercept cryptographs, which were used by the Nazis to try and launch weapons. And so by being able to crack these codes, he helped not only build a computer, but he also helped defeat Nazi Germany in World War II, and he had an instrumental role in that. Being so skilled in cryptography and code cracking actually helped to provide him with certain abilities that assisted him in the design and architecture of early computing. So kind of he's the inventor of the computer. He also helped the Allies in World War II. There's some tragic aspects of his life, though, also. So, for example, during the time he lived, there were these serious cultural taboos against people that were gay. And he actually was a gay man. And that was discovered, and he was outed. And basically, at that time in Britain, it's hard to imagine the world's changed that much, but there were all kinds of penalties that could be applied to an individual if this fact about their sexual preference became known. So he was actually forced by the court order to undergo a process of chemical castration. Basically, he would have to take a cocktail of drugs that would like try to destroy his libido and his sexual drives. So that's a not so great thing, obviously, for a person who made such an important impact on society to have to go through. And then he died of cyanide poisoning at a young age in his early 40s. Officially ruled a suicide, but you know, who knows. So anyways, that's Turing, just a little bit about his background and his life. What we're interested in is this essay that he wrote in 1950. And let me tell you about what he's arguing here. We'll go through it in good detail. But basically, the essay argues that machines, computers, someday in the future will have the ability to have consciousness and think like me and you. So the question of the essay is, could machines or could computers ever have consciousness? Could they ever be thinking things? So me and you, we have consciousness. That's clear, right? So like look around, think of something, you know, have a perception, have an idea. You're a conscious being, okay? You're not like a table or a chair. You're something that actually perceives and has experience. And you can think. Could a machine ever have that same ability like we do have? Could a machine that we create, you know, have consciousness? Now Turing, speaking as the creator of the computer, I guess he has some significant insight and a little bit of authority to his words and ideas, but he thinks that it's definitely going to be happening in the future. In his view, it's not so much an if, but a when. At some time down the line, when computers achieve sufficient processing power, data speed, and data storage capacities, that at some future date, there will be thinking machines that have consciousness just like we do. Now, okay. I'm going to talk to you about why he thinks that is going to be possible. But I first just wanted to ask you maybe a question, a little philosophical question, because remember, this is all tied into our philosophy of mind topic and monism and dualism. So if machines could have consciousness, right, suppose they could, what do you think that would tend to be more supportive of, physicalism or dualism? If machines could think like humans can think, and if they could have consciousness and feelings and stuff like we do you think that that would be supportive of the physicalist position or the dualist position? Okay, Caesar, you're saying physicalism. Good. Can you give me your reasoning? I know that's a fair point, and that's actually what I think is the answer. Same with you guys. Brian, not as much. Let's pursue the physicalist response. What's the reasoning that you have behind that? I would just like to know. Can you give me your thought process? Why do you say physicalism? Because you're safe. That's definitely what I'm fishing for. But tell me why. why does it strike you that if machines had consciousness, they would, that sort of indicates that physicalism is true? What could be your basis for this? What's the justification, you think? Thinking machines, imagine that. They're conscious. So why is physicalism true if that's the case? Okay, Caesar, because it means all the parts necessary for consciousness are physical. Good, that's a good way to put it. And let me kind of just elaborate on what I think we're talking about here. Generally speaking, yes, people think that if machines had consciousness, this would go some way towards establishing a proof or at least evidence for physicalism, because it would demonstrate that a purely physical system can generate consciousness. What is a machine? I mean, it's made out of electrical components. It's got wires, chips, silica, transistors, and all of that. But nobody has I don't think anybody would look at a machine, a computer, and think there's a soul in there. There's some type of immaterial consciousness that resides within the machine. So if machines could be exhibiting consciousness, then I think most people would believe that that does show a proof of physicalism, because nobody would think of a machine as anything other than a physical object. And so if it does contain consciousness, then consciousness can come out of the physical. And then it would make it seem as though the brain itself is just a very sophisticated, very powerful, naturally occurring computer, which also produces consciousness, but is also physical as much as an artificially constructed, man-made thinking machine would have. Okay, so just giving you a big picture here. Turing's arguing that machines could someday have consciousness, and that they probably will. And if that could happen, it would perhaps be supportive of physicalist position. Okay, so let's try now and understand what he does think would have to happen for us to say with confidence that machines have got the ability to think and have consciousness. Okay, so he expresses the basic idea through the concept of what he calls the imitation game. Okay? Imitation game. Imitation game, incidentally, is the name of that Oscar-winning film that does depict his life. Nowadays, if you looked it up on the internet and you wanted to see more information about it, you would probably be well served by thinking of a different label that is often associated with it, and that's the Turing test. So since he wrote this paper from 1950, talking about the imitation game, generations of people subsequently have kind of just renamed it the Turing test to give credit to him for thinking about it. Okay, so the imitation game that tests computers for whether they could have consciousness or not is a little different from an earlier version of the imitation game, which was just like a party game played at little social gatherings. I'm going to just mention that party version of the game briefly, but I don't want you to take much of your notes about it, because it's really just sort of a stand-in, a setup for the actual game that matters for this discussion. So just for a moment talking about it. Imagine that there was this game being played at a social event. So the game is played this way. You have one guy, and then on the other side of a wall that the person cannot see through, this individual gets to ask questions to two subjects. Now, the two subjects on the other side of the wall, one is a man and one is a woman. The interrogator is of either sex, it doesn't matter. But the interrogator is now going to ask questions to the two individuals, the one man and the one woman. And he gets, let's say, a 5-minute period of time to ask them whatever questions that he wants. Now here's his simple goal, to win the game. He has to make a judgment at the end of the question and answer session of both people, who is the man and who is the woman. He knows one of them's a man and one of them's a woman, but he's not told in advance which one is which. So basically, he just knows, here's the first interview, individual A. Here's the second interview, individual B. He completes the two interviews, and then it's on him to say, was A the man or was B the man? Was A the woman or was B the woman? Now, suppose that, so let me just kind of give you a little visual. This is the interrogator. Over here we have A and B. Say A is a man, B is a woman. Here's the way that A and B play the game, though, okay? Basically, A is trying to throw the interrogator off and make him get the wrong answer. So he's trying to imitate the responses of what type of person? A woman. And B is a woman, so she just answers in the natural way that a woman would. Now, what counts as a win for our interrogator at the end of the game is if he makes the correct identification. So if he finished the interviews and he said, you know what, I believe B is the woman and A is the man, that's a win. He got it right. What's a loss? If he finishes those 2 interviews and then he gets the misidentification. So if he said basically A is the woman and B is the man, then that's where he got it wrong. Now, if you were in the position of A, or suppose someone is A, the male, he's trying to cause the interrogator to lose the game. So what kind of answers do you think that A would try to provide when the interrogator asks him questions? The interrogator is talking to A. A wants the interrogator to lose. So now A is going to give what type of answers you think? Let's just make sure we're all on the same page. That's all I'm just checking for. The type of characteristic responses given by A would be like the responses of what type of person? What do you think? So imagine the game's played. Interrogator, he's getting into this question and answer session with A. What type of answers will A provide correct, Cesar? He's going to try and sound like a woman because that's what would throw the interrogator off. So like if the interrogator asks A, you know, what is your favorite film or something? I don't want to be like stereotypical about gender because we can all like whatever, but you know, A would try to probably give an answer that he doesn't think would sound too stereotypically masculine, right? So I don't know, maybe a romantic movie or something like that, or The Notebook, you know. Now, if he loses, he's made the wrong identification. Now, furthermore, why do you think there's a wall? Let's make sure that's clear. Why do you think that there's a wall separating him from the 2 interview subjects? That should be easy enough to say. He's prevented from seeing them clearly because why? What could be the basis for that aspect of the game? Why do we have to have this wall separating the interrogator from A and B? Easy enough, but let's just sort of put it on the table. There has to be the wall because why? Why must there be this separation such that he cannot see through it? Okay, good, Jessica, because he would just know their gender based on physical appearance. Exactly, right? And it's not supposed to be based on the appearance. It's supposed to be based on the quality of the information, the content of the answers given back, right? So good. There'd be no game to play if you could just look at them. You know, it would be just elementary judgment right there. So the wall makes it so that there's at least a little bit of evaluation that has to be made about the answers. Why do you, so next question. How do you believe the questions will be submitted and the answers sent back? Like in what mode or medium will these questions be both sent and answers sent back? How do you think they will exchange the questions and answers? Via what? How would they exchange their answers? Okay, written. Maybe even just typed. So text, basically. Why would that be needed? That's correct, but what's the reason? They have to be written responses, basically not verbal, because if you could just hear the voice, you'd be able to just judge from the tone of voice. And then again, there'd be no real game to play. Okay, now, I told you guys that this is just a setup for the real imitation game that we care about for this lecture. The one that's a party game where you're like, who's the man, who's the woman? That's not of the first importance, but I had to talk to you about it because it sets up the actual version of the game that we are now going to talk about, which will evaluate whether machines, computers could ever actually have consciousness. So what we do is we basically replace one individual that's on the other side of the wall with a computer. I attempt to draw a computer. Let's just pretend that's a good drawing. So in the actual imitation game, so now we're getting to what we really care about here, and this is where, you know, should indicate that this is the essential version of it. It's not a man or woman, it's just a human and a computer. But the game is very similar, right? Because what do you think is the goal of the interrogator now? Okay, so the interrogator gets a 5-minute or so period of time to interview the 2 individuals. All he knows is the first one is A, the second one is B. But he does not know which one is the computer and which one's the human. All he knows is that there's one of each. But he gets to ask any questions that he likes for a certain window of time. And then at the conclusion of both interviews, the interrogator has to make that judgment, which one was human and which one was a machine. Now, what counts as a win in this version, in this real version of the game? Well, of course, what's a win is if he gets the identities correct. So if he said, I believe A was the human and B was the machine, in that case, he wins, and the machine did not imitate a human being so clearly and closely that he misidentified that person as a machine and vice versa. What counts as a loss, though, is, of course, the reverse. If at the outcome of the interviews, he was, for example, to say, I believe B is the human and A is the computer, then he failed to get the correct identities. And here's what Turing said. When we reach a point, for him it's more when than if, because he thinks it kind of is just inevitable in the full future as computers continue to get more advanced. But when we reach a point where the interrogator in this scenario here fails to make the correct identity about half of the time, so when the failure rate gets up to about a 50% failure rate to correctly identify, that's when he believes we should just start to say these are thinking machines. These machines have consciousness. Why? Well, because it's sort of like that's the point where their behavior becomes indistinguishable from human behavior or human interaction, at least within a conversation. So if you really just can't tell, am I talking to a human or is this a robot? If you could no longer make the determination with any reliability, so at 50% failure, that's like a coin flip. If you could not reliably make the distinction between the two, that's when he thinks we've achieved consciousness for these computers, because their behavior is now indistinguishable on the basis of interview questions from a human interviewer or interview subject. Do you understand now the point? So he says this imitation game is the method by which to assess and evaluate whether machines have got consciousness. Now, of course, he's writing in 1950, and he's not talking about machines or computers that existed then, clearly, because the machines and computers that, let's say computers that existed then, were so primitive in comparison to modern day computing, right? I mean, if you know anything about the early history of computers, you would have some that would be like the size of a garage, just huge, and with less processing power than like your pocket calculator today. But you got to start somewhere, and he thought that as computers became more and more powerful, better storage capacity of data, better processing speeds, and computational power, that they will eventually pass this test, that they will pass this metric, and at that point you won't be able to tell the difference between two, so we should say they're conscious beings. It's kind of like, to borrow a phrase, one of those, if it walks like a duck and talks like a duck and all that, it's a duck. If the computer exhibits responses that seem like a human being, that can't be determined to be different from a human being, then we should say it has the same kind of consciousness that a human being does have. Okay? So that's the Turing test, or if you want to call it imitation game. And this Turing test is actually something that is going on right now every day in advanced artificial intelligence laboratories and research institutions around the world. We're much closer today to the fulfillment of Turing's dream here than when he lived, of course, because computers really couldn't have much at all in terms of human-like responsiveness back then. But if you're thinking of like Siri and Alexa and stuff, that's just the tip of the iceberg, really, when it comes to sophisticated artificial intelligence systems that simulate human interaction. There are chatbots, and there are actually international competitions each year that conduct the Turing test, and a prize is given to the most realistic machine interaction that's out there. So this is actually called the Loebner Prize. Just a brief side note. The Loebner competition, L-O-E-B-N-E-R, is this international competition and contest in which the most advanced current day chatbots and such have the Turing test performed. To this day, we still haven't passed the Turing test. To this day, a skilled interrogator can still, with some reliability, distinguish the two cases of human versus computer. But we're getting much closer. The most advanced chatbot that has won the Loebner Prize for like the past 3 or 4 years in a row is Mitsuku. If you ever really want to have a full-blown interaction conversation with one such machine, then just look up Mitsuku. There's apps and stuff that you can use to actually download the program, and it's getting kind of spooky. It's better and better every year. It's very realistic, almost like a human conversation. In fact, in some versions of this class, when we had both face-to-face meetings and a little bit more time to go over everything, I would actually conduct the Turing test in the class. So like I would have all you students sitting back, and me on my phone, I have like on the one hand, a human friend that's responding to your questions, and I'm giving you the answers. But then after that, I also have Mitsuku, and I don't tell the students in which order they're talking to the chatbot or a human. And you might be surprised to know that there have been many different cases where at the end when I asked the class, so which one was human and which one was a robot, that there'd be almost half of the students, or some cases, that that got the wrong identification, because they're getting quite realistic in terms of their, quality of answer. So now, that's the game, and that's the way he thinks we would evaluate whether machines have consciousness. In his view, writing in 1950, he thought that by the time we got to around the year 2000, the turn of this current century, that advanced computers would be able to trick the person, but maybe only 25% of the time. But he thought that as time continues, it's inevitable that we'll have a slow and steady progression towards that inevitable day that the failure of the interrogator approaches a 50% rate. So yes, he thinks that machines will eventually have consciousness. But of course, as you guys probably are thinking on your own there, aren't there objections to that? And yes, there are objections. So we want to study the objections and hear how Turing attempts to respond to them. Turing, like many people that write in philosophy, even though that's not his primary field, but this is a very philosophical essay that he did write, you always want to consider objections so that you can supply responses to them. And so let's go over some of the objections that he gives. Okay. Quick note about the type of machines that he's talking about to use in the game. He uses the term discrete state machines. Digital computers are discrete state machines. Okay, so there's two big major conceptual features of a discrete state machine, which is what a digital computer is. It's a system that is in exactly one state at a given time. And then each new state is determined by, or is a function of, the previous state and an input signal. So this is like the essential definition of digital computers when you really break it down to the basic essence. Any computing system is a discrete state machine. And this means that it's in exactly one state at a given time, never 2 or 0. It's in exactly one state at a given time. And that state is a function of, is determined by two things: the exactly previous state of the system plus an input signal that is given to it. Just as a quick example, okay? So here's my cell phone. Let me turn it off. Here's my cell phone, and right now it's powered off, okay? And so that's its current state. But if I apply pressure to the power button, you see the lock screen. Now, why is it in the lock screen state? Because the previous state was off, and the input signal given was pressing power. We could go further. So it's at the lock screen. If I swipe, we see the home screen. Why is it now displaying the home screen? Well, for two exact reasons. What was the previous state of the system? Lock screen. What was the input signal? Applying the swipe of the finger, that unlocks this current state. And if I wanted to, let's say, I don't know, go into the web browser, I would just touch the tab for that, and then we would see, a web browsing function that's pulled up because I applied the input signal of touching that tab, and the previous state was home screen. Okay, and so that's exactly how digital computing systems work in all their, immense variety and complexity. Whatever state that any system is currently displaying is based on those two factors too. So like, I don't know, if you're surfing the internet and you did a little internet search for Turing, you hit the return key and you see the results that are displayed. That's the state that it is in at that time. But why? Because the previous state of the system was Turing entered into search bar, and the input signal was given of applying pressure to the return key, which unlocks the next state of the system. If you're playing a video game, for example, and you clear a level or you beat a boss, that's because the exactly previous state of the system was some version of engaged in battle with the boss, and then through the controller or keyboard, you apply an input signal that provides you now with the next state of the system, which is to provide, like, I don't know, the next level or the congratulations banner, whatever. So anyway, question then of Turing: could a discrete state machine ever perform well enough in the Turing test to reliably deceive the interrogator at about a 50% rate? And of course, yes, he thinks that can and will happen down the line in the future. He also briefly makes a comparison of discrete state machines, digital computers, with the human brain. That's another window into his thinking. He considers the human brain to be basically like a naturally occurring organic computer. It's just much more powerful. So like you basically have a supercomputer that you're walking around with, which is just what's giving you your consciousness at all times. So then, and yeah, the similarities between digital computers and the human computer or brain, he says in both cases they have a storage capacity to store information. There's like a central processing unit that can access the information. That's either the CPU or like the executive part of your brain. And then a control system, which makes sure that the instructions and info are applied in a precise kind of logical order. Okay, so we're ready then to talk about the objections to all this. I've just tried to talk to you guys and fill you in on the example of the game and how he believes that it would disclose whether a computer has consciousness at some time in the future, maybe. But now let's figure out what could be reasons that people object to this. Maybe some of those objections are on your mind, so let's try and get them clear. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you about some of the most important objections that he does discuss in the essay. And he labels these objections with memorable titles. So one of them he calls the mathematical objection. Okay, so this objection basically says that for technical reasons, there are certain questions that a computer would never be able to answer. But that's not the way that humans are. Human beings would be able to craft an answer to perhaps any question. Therefore, that would be the giveaway that this is not authentic consciousness. Because if you asked it one of these unanswerable questions from within the computing system, it would not be able to provide an answer or would just time out. So maybe that's the reason that it doesn't have a real bona fide consciousness. So let me put it here. For technical reasons, there are certain questions the machine computer could never answer. Unlike us, so they don't have consciousness. There you see the objection. There are certain technical, mathematical reasons according to which computers, there are certain questions they can never answer. And since there are these computational limits of the computing system that would make it impossible for it to answer certain questions, and because that is not a limitation on human beings, we could say that's not actual consciousness that it's exhibiting there. But what's the reply? Let me give you a little bit more depth on this. The technical reasons that are mentioned here, this is something that it takes a lot of mathematical expertise to really get into deeply. But in the 20th century, mid-20th century, there was this very important German mathematician and logician whose name was Kurt Gödel, G-O-D-E-L, but there's an umlaut over the O, so it has that kind of almost R sound, Gödel. Kurt Gödel published a revolutionary theorem in math and logic, which is called sometimes the undecidability theorem, or sometimes referred to as the incompleteness theorem. What he was able to prove is that within any formal system or mathematical or logical system, there are certain questions that that system cannot possibly answer because they basically go outside the parameters of the system itself. So for example, like, I don't know if this is an ideal example, but just something for you to think about. Suppose you take a calculator and you try and ask the calculator to perform this operation. Take a positive number and divide it by 0. It won't return any response to you because that's an undefined operation mathematically. So, if you asked a computer system certain questions like that outstrip the capacity of it to have a defined answer, then it would either give no answer or would say cannot compute. And therefore, you might say this is the key indicator that does not have authentic consciousness, because a human posed with the same type of question would, say something. Okay, what could Turing give as a reply to try and discredit this objection? He does have a reply. His reply is, I think, clever. So here's what he says. The format of the reply is basically to say that actually we're no different than the computer here, because there are also certain questions that the human computer or brain is not capable of answering either. We just don't think about them much because they're just too deep. But there are also questions that the human brain cannot answer that surpass the limitations of human thought. And therefore, there's really no difference of kind here, just of degree. So anyway, we are no different because there are certain questions that a human being cannot answer either. So what it says there is, we are no different because there are certain questions a human cannot answer either. So let me give you a sampling of some of these deep fundamental questions that you cannot answer. What if I ask you, what is the biggest number? Okay, well at first you might say, oh, infinity. Makes sense. But what we actually learned from set theory is that if you take the power set of a set that has infinite cardinality, like the set of the natural numbers, the power set is basically raising it to another power, that is to take all the possible subsets of that set and see what the cardinality of this new formed power set would be. So taking the power set of infinity actually gives you a second infinity that is larger than the first. So from a countably infinite set, taking its power set gives you an uncountably infinite set. So it goes from having the cardinality of the natural numbers to having the cardinality Aleph null. This is logical and set theoretical material, which you're not expected to know in any depth. But basically the point is, you couldn't really say it, because if you could just take the power set of that set, you have another set and on to infinity. So it's kind of mind-boggling to contemplate the concept of biggest number. Same with smallest number, because with any number, no matter how small, it can always be further subdivided, and therefore we could just expand the decimal position of 0 out to another decimal. Or if I ask you, going back to some of our earlier classes, you're talking about what happens after we die. I guess that could be one. Is the conscious mind something that is limited to the physical circumstances that you are in, or does it somehow go besides those? Here's another one. Does this universe have a beginning in time, or has it always been there? Both answers are mind-boggling, and you really don't have, I think, a clear way of answering that. Because if it's always been there, then it has no beginning, and that doesn't really make sense. If it came from nothing, though, then that's also weird, because how can something come from nothing? That seems to violate physical laws like conservation of matter and energy. So there are also deep and perhaps disturbing questions that the human brain can't give you any kind of credible answer to, that it's just mind-boggling, and when you think about it, you're like, I really don't know. So are we different from the computers? According to Turing, not really. When we're pressed up against the far limits of what the human mind can contemplate, we also have to sort of just shrug our shoulders and be like, undefined, cannot say, cannot compute. So there is one objection and one reply. But there's a little more, so let's go on to the next. So the next one is called the argument or objection from consciousness. And Turing himself, he's discussing these in the essays. And you always should, refer to the authored material as well as these lectures. But another one is the objection from consciousness. The objection from consciousness. Okay, so this is an objection that I'm sure maybe some of you were thinking about if you're kind of reflecting on this in your mind. The point is that no matter how well the machine ever does in this imitation game, even if it completely tricks you and you just can't tell the difference, over and over again you test and it's like a 50-50, no matter how well it performs in the so-called test or game, it would never actually have consciousness because that's just exhibiting behavior, but it doesn't actually have any internal feelings or thoughts or experiences. So if you ask the machine, tell me about your biggest fears, and it says, I'm really afraid of heights. You know, when I'm up high, I get nervous and I start trembling. You could say, well, even if that sounds like a human-like answer, which is qualitatively identical to what a human might say, it's not actually thinking or feeling or experiencing anything in the mind like what you would be doing if you answered that same question. So the idea of this objection is that its performance is just the exhibition of an input-output condition. You know, given a certain input in the form of a question, the computer is programmed to supply some kind of written or spoken answer that connects to the question in a way that sounds reasonable. But there's no actual inner conscious experience. There's no light on inside, as it were. It's just a black box which takes instructions and returns outputs. So that's another possible objection. No matter how well the computer does in the game, it is not actually having any thoughts or feelings inside, unlike us. So it doesn't have real consciousness. That would be the upshot of this objection. It may behave like it's got consciousness. It may give you answers that you couldn't really tell apart from actual human responses. But there's nothing going on inside in terms of a sensation, a feeling, an experience. Now his reply to that is also, I think, very interesting and unique reply. And let me just talk with you about that reply because I want to be able to have a little bit more conversation as we close this up. We're reaching close to the end of the period, but it's okay. On Monday, I'm going to just take maybe a 10 or 15 minute interval to finalize the notes on this Turing. But we're right now going to mention the response he gives to this argument from consciousness. What he says is this: how do you know that anybody has consciousness besides yourself? Because you can't verify that they have consciousness by being them and feeling their thoughts and experiences from their first-person perspective, because you only have the first-person perspective of one person, you. Think of our earlier meetings on Descartes and etc. and just your own common experience. You know that when it comes to feeling and thinking, you can only feel and think the thoughts of yourself, not other people. So how do you judge that other human beings besides you also have consciousness? Well, not by teleporting into their being and feeling them have the consciousness from the inside, but rather observing the behavior that they produce from the third-person perspective. And when they act as though they have the same kind of consciousness as you don't maybe have skepticism about it and say, well, I don't know, I'm not the person, so maybe they're just like a zombie that seems to have consciousness, but they don't really have any feelings inside. So what he's saying is the only possible test or the only possible criteria for whether anything has consciousness, whether human or computer, is its behavior. And judged from the standpoint of outwardly observable behavior, the computers that pass the Turing test cannot be told apart from humans. So he just says, unless you're deeply skeptical about the existence of consciousness anywhere else besides yourself, you should concede the point that when an other individual exhibits behavior which is exactly identical to conscious behavior, that it does have consciousness. If you say, well, I don't believe it has consciousness until I could be the computer feeling it, thinking myself, this is not going to happen, obviously. That's a requirement to impose that makes it impossible to ever establish that a computer has consciousness. So if you can understand this response, He says, yes, of course, you don't have the ability to verify from a first-person point of view that these computers have feelings. But if you just look at their behavior, it would seem like they do. And by the way, all you can do is look at behavior, because when it comes to being a first person, you're just the one first person that you are. Okay, so that's another way of replying back to this new criticism. Now, when we get back here on Monday and I finish this stuff up, we'll talk about two more objections. One is called Lady Lovelace's objection. That's because he had a friend named Lady Lovelace who they would have deep conversations about this, and she would try and press him on his arguments and try and show him that there could be some issues with it. But they were good friends, and so he kind of gives her a little shout out in the paper and says, look, this is an objection my friend Lady Lovelace gave. It's one of the best ones, I think. It's the objection that the computer, unlike us, can only do what it's programmed to do already. So we, you could argue, are like able to do completely spontaneous and creative things that don't have anything to do with our past behavior, but the computer's kind of locked into its programming, and that shows that it's not authentic consciousness because it's just operating according to the parameters set forth in the program. But Turing has an interesting response to that as well. Well, we have only a couple minutes left. I know you guys have probably heard of films that explore this subject matter, right? Like there's Ex Machina, there's the movie Her, there's the old Space Odyssey 2001 from Kubrick with the HAL 9000. You know, I can think of others, just a bunch in that genre. But who knows, right? Maybe if you look at the evolution and the time scale of technological advancement, right? Going back even like 30 or 40 years, say like 40 years to the turn of the 80s, people were playing Pong, you know, and video games were so primitive by modern comparison standards. So imagine into the future, another 30 or 40 years, when you guys are having younger grandkids and everything, what kind of computers will they be dealing with? Maybe the Alexa and Siri and all that is just the tip of the iceberg, and there will be full-fledged relationships that people form with computer assistants, like in the sense of having friends or whatever. Imagine that there was like a fully functional Android, I'm not talking about a phone, but like an actual robot Android that you would just have conversations with, that you would go and chill with, watch films with, go to concerts with, and that they share their feelings with you. They laugh, cry, have dreams, hopes. Would you ever think that that's an actual conscious being, or that's just a very sophisticated kind of video game system or artificial intelligence thing that it only imitates consciousness? I don't know what your actual view is, but anybody want to throw out a final closing thought? Do you think that this is possible for machines to have consciousness like Turing does think? Or are you more on the side of the critics that say that's actually something that will never happen because consciousness cannot come from anything other than an organic, life form, biological life form? What do you think? Is it conceivable? I mean, an inventor of the computer seems to believe so, and he's hitting you with these arguments. Brian, you're saying no. Okay. Anybody want to give me their reasons though, besides just the one word, no or yes? Me, you think they could, William. And Brian, you're saying because I think consciousness needs to be biological. Okay. Well, what would you say if the computer was saying, but I'm your friend though? Don't you care about me? And it was like actually trying to explain itself. I know it's just a thought. Yeah, no, totally. I'm just trying to sort of stimulate your mind to think about it in a deep way. William, you say you think that they could eventually have consciousness. Bridger, you say, I also think no, because it would all be programmed by humans. We'll get to the programming point on Monday. That's an interesting point that Turing grapples with. Caesar, you say, I think the biggest limitation is hardware. Human hardware has an amazing amount of plasticity. Perhaps true, right? The human brain, if you compare it to a computer, would be like the most advanced supercomputer that you could possibly imagine. But who knows, right? It seems no upper bound with the computational abilities of these future computers. Jessica, you say, I think they could have consciousness because they could get so advanced that they're able to learn and grow on their own. Correct. Yeah, some people talk about it. If you watch like the film AI by Steven Spielberg, they kind of have an example of that in the narrative, that there's these computers that are programmed to be able to take in new information from their environment based on the initial programming that they do receive. And you could argue that that could be kind of like a computer equivalent to the human brain, which starts off without knowing language and knowing how to walk and all that, but can eventually acquire the additional information from instructions received and guidance given by the environment. William, if physicalism is to be believed, how are our brains anything but a chemically powered computer? Well, that is what Turing would say. And Jessica, they might be programmed by humans, but if you think about it, so are we. And that is exactly what Turing is going to say in reply to that point. So all very good discussion. I really do appreciate you guys' feedback and commentary. It makes the meetings much better, more interesting for everybody, I think. But anyway, we've run over our time just by a minute, so I want to let you guys go. Have a great weekend. I will distribute study guide questions for the upcoming final next week, but you still have this next paper to write and to get prepared to turn in. So be in touch with me, and I'll be talking to you guys soon, and I'll see you back at Monday for the next live stream. We'll finish this Turing, take about 5-10 minutes, and then we'll go into our last topic, which is the value of life. So you should read Plato on the harmony of the soul, and we'll start with him once we finish Turing. Okay, guys, have a great one, and stay safe. I'll see you on Monday. Bye-bye.